Good morning. If you can hear me, clap one time. If you can hear me, clap two times. All right. Just want to give everyone a moment to bring their attention to the front of the room. Thank you, everyone, so much for being here. I want to welcome the faculty, students, staff, any faith members, any community members here from Greensboro that we have in the room, I just want to say welcome on behalf of Bennett College. My name is Ryan Peterson, and I am the Director of Counseling Services here at Bennett. I'm so excited to have you all in the room for the 3rd annual Steve Fund Girls of Color Convening. Young Women of Color Convening. We are truly grateful for your presence here today, and we are privileged to have the president of Bennett College here with us, Ms. Susan Walsh, and Dr. Joy Harden-Bradford, who are going to lead us in a fireside chat. Dr. Joy is the founder and host of Therapy for Black Girls. I know lots of us around here are familiar with the podcast and the directory. Their extensive expertise and insight will guide us in understanding the importance of forming healthy relationships, setting healthy boundaries, and building positive and affirming relationships with loved ones and community members. As you listen today, please take note on the cards on your table. At the end of the fireside chat, we will be having a question and answer portion, and we would love to hear from you all. This is a student-focused event, and we want to make sure that your voices are heard, okay? Before we get into the fireside chat, I would like to bring up Dr. Gina Duncan, who is a mental health advocate at the Steve Fund. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Duncan.
Good morning. It's such a pleasure to be with you. My name is Dr. Gina Duncan. I'm a psychiatrist in private practice in Charlotte and also a mental health advisor for the Steve Fund. So on behalf of the Steve Fund team and its board, I thank you for attending today's fireside chat, which was made possible with support from the Keenan Trust Foundation. For those unfamiliar with the Steve Fund is a leading nonprofit organization focused on transforming educational, organizational, and workplace environments to support the mental health and emotional well-being of young people of color. Building knowledge and capacity among organizations serving young people is critical to the Steve Fund's mission. The Steve Fund offers various solutions to assist colleges, universities, nonprofits, and workplaces to enhance their capacity to promote mental health and emotional well-being for young people of color. As Ms. Peterson mentioned, today's event is focused on the importance of forming healthy relationships, setting healthy boundaries, and building positive and affirming relationships with loved ones and community members. We understand that today's conversation may bring up a variety of feelings. If you need to take a moment, we have a respite space available for you and mental health counselors should you need them. Counselors, could you please raise your hand? Okay. All right, well, I am thrilled to introduce our esteemed speakers for the day. First, we have Dr. Joy Harden-Bradford. Dr. Harden-Bradford is a licensed psychologist, speaker, founder, and CEO of Therapy for Black Girls, and host of its wildly popular mental health podcast. She's also the author of Sisterhood Heals, the transformative power of healing in community. Her work focuses on making mental health topics more relevant and accessible for Black women. She specializes in creating spaces for them to have fuller and healthier relationships with themselves and others. Joining Dr. Harden-Bradford is our host, President Suzanne Walsh. President Walsh, who assumed the role of the 19th president of Bennett College on August 1st, 2019, has garnered national recognition for her work with organizations at the intersection of innovation, technology, and learning. Her ability to create and collaborate with cross-functional teams has been instrumental in implementing flexible, personalized, and affordable approaches to higher education. Her work on several viability and sustainability initiatives at HBCUs has been highly appreciated, showcasing her prowess in analyzing complex situations, developing innovative action plans, and motivating teams. So I would like to hand it over to President Walsh and Dr. Harden-Bradford.
I just said I think that the seat with the tissues is for me, because you know how I get. Hi, everyone. Hey. We are here to talk about relationships. Are you ready for that? Yes, maybe. Hi. Come on in. I like that we're wearing matching colors. So I want to start with a couple of things. First of all, thank you so much for coming to Greensboro, North Carolina.
Absolutely.
We're like just over a month out from Valentine's Day. Mother's Day is coming up. Father's Day is coming up. There are all kinds of relationships that people struggle with. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to spend our time talking about lots of different kinds of relationships and trying to think it through together about what makes for a healthy relationship. But I want to start by quoting, and for Bennett students, I'm not going to try to quote the poetess Nicki Minaj again, because you all took over my quote last time. So this time, I'm going to quote Bell Hooks. Thank you. And she has this incredible book that she wrote about, it's called All About Love. And in it, she says, had I been given a clear definition of love earlier in my life, it would not have taken me so long to become a more loving person. Had I shared with others a common understanding of what it means to love, it would have been easier to create love. Definitions are vital starting points for the imagination. What we cannot imagine cannot come into being. A good definition marks our starting point and lets us know where we want to end up. As we move toward our desired destination, we chart the journey, creating a map. We need a map to guide us on our journey to love, starting with the place where we know what we mean when we speak of love. So I know, right? Look, go
Beautiful.
ahead. Right?
Beautiful
Go ahead,
quote.
Bell Hooks. So I start with that because today I think we want to create a map. We want to create a map to healthy relationships, but we have to start by defining. What is a relationship? Because that's a big word. Just go ahead, start there, Dr. Joy. No big deal, just start there.
Right, we'll just start at the beginning. So one, thank you all for having me. It has been beautiful to visit Greensboro for the first time, so I'm very, very happy to be with you this morning. So I think when we're talking about a relationship, we're talking about a connection between two or more people. And relationships really are the foundation of all of our lives, our relationships both with other people, but also the relationship with ourselves, which I think the quote kind of beautifully illustrates that the relationship we have with ourselves and the stories we tell about ourselves to ourselves really dictate the way that relationships look with other people. So I think we have to start there.
And so when we think about, at Bennett, when we think about relationships, we have sisterhood. That's one of those relationships. So that's sisterhood amongst all of our students. When we think about, and we also have all kinds of other relationships, whether they be romantic, whether they be with families. Are all relationships the same? Are all those connections the same? Do we treat them the same?
So I don't think that they're the same. I think that there are some relationships we have that are looser, right? So you have relationships maybe with people that are in your residence hall, but you're not super close with, or relationships with your teachers and your instructors, of course, look different than the relationships with your family. But I think in all relationships, there are some common themes, right? So one of the things that I think is really a hallmark of a healthy relationship is reciprocity. So relationships should not feel one-sided. They should not feel like you are the one doing all of the heavy lifting, regardless of what that relationship is. And I think healthy communication is also a hallmark of a healthy relationship. Oh, we got a lot of echoing here. I want your questions when it's time for Q&A so we can get into this. But I think healthy communication, and communication, I think sometimes conflict gets a bad word. Like it feels like conflict is a bad word because we're like, oh my gosh, there's conflict. Like, what do I do? But conflict just means that we're human, right? Like we are entering relationships with all of our own history, all of our own baggage, all of our own stuff, and the other person is bringing all of their stuff. And so, of course, there's going to be differences. But it really is really how you navigate conflict that I think speaks to the health of the relationship.
So if you want to raise your hand, you can, or you can just think to yourself, because I think Dr. Joy just brought up a really important point. So starting with, like, some relationships are looser relationships, and then you talked about that reciprocity is important. It should not be one-sided. You don't really have to answer, but I'm still going to ask. Has anyone ever been in a one-sided relationship? Oh, okay, yes, right. And how does that feel?
And I love that. So tell me what feels not good about it. Anybody want to throw out something? Yeah.
So you're giving out all the deposits, but you're being depleted. Anybody else want to add anything? Not being poured into the way you expect to be.
So let's sit there, because even as you started, President Marsh, you talked about all of these holidays that are coming up, and holidays can be real triggers and pain points for a lot of our relationships. And one of the reasons is because of what you just shared, is expectations. So we often have lots of expectations about how we think things are going to play out, but what we don't typically do is voice that to other people, right? So we have this whole idea of like, oh, it's my birthday, it's Mother's Day, I know they're gonna do all this beautiful stuff for me, and then that doesn't happen. But did you actually tell anybody what you expected, right? And so I think a lot of times we get into this situation of wanting people to be like mind readers, because we think that that demonstrates how much love they have for us and how much care they have for us, because they should just know, right? But do you have the best chance of getting what you want out of relationships when you actually ask for it? And a lot of times we don't ask because of lots of different reasons. But one of the reasons is because we think people should just know. But people don't always know unless we tell them. So expectations is really a place where there can be some breakdown in relationships, because we have these expectations that people don't meet, but we haven't actually told them what our expectations are.
Well, and then you just said that healthy communication is critical. So what does healthy communication look like? So not expecting somebody to be a mind reader is one, but what else does that look like?
It also means asserting our needs. So I think a lot of us have been taught to kind of play very small and like, oh, I don't need to take up very much space. I don't need very much. I'm not high maintenance, right? But it's okay. Like, relationships are maintenance, and you do have needs. And so there is no real worth or value in you pretending as if you don't need things from the people that you are in relationships with. And so another part of healthy communication is also assertiveness and being able to tell people, hey, this is what I would like, or this is how I expect to be treated. I think that that's another one. Tone, of course, is also another important part of communication, right? And there's not always going to be a perfect way to say things, but you know how you say things when you're like frustrated and upset versus, when you're not in that space, right? Something else to think about is timing. So again, there's not always going to be a perfect time for certain conversations, but there are definitely some times that are going to be better than others. So taking all of those things into consideration, I think, is important in communication.
And as we think about communication and we think about reciprocity, but maybe let me start with communication. Does it matter about gender? So in other words, if I'm in a relationship with another woman, does that matter? If I'm in a relationship with a man, does it matter? Does it matter if it's a parent, a male, a female, a caring adult? Does gender play into this at all?
I won't say that it plays into it, but I do think that there are power dynamics to consider, right? So if we're talking to a professor or instructor or our parents, like, there's a different power dynamic that happens there versus in relationships with your peers. And so I think it's important for both parties in a conversation and in communication to be mindful that there are certain power dynamics that exist, right? And so your parents saying something to you, I think they need to be mindful of, like, do you really have the opportunity to say no to your parent, right? And so being mindful of like any power you have over other people in relationships, I think, is important.
Well, but sometimes what I worry about is the power dynamic even in a relationship. So we may be dating, but somebody may, in an unhealthy way, have more power, or maybe I have more power and I'm exerting it. And that, can you talk about the power dynamics in a like in a romantic or a dating relationship?
Yeah, so I've seen some concerning things, President Marsh, on TikTok around like some of the, look at her face, around some of these power dynamics, because going back to our earlier conversation about reciprocity and feeling reciprocal, in relationships, you want to have shared power. So we are both making decisions. We both feel like our voices can be heard in this relationship. What oftentimes happens in unhealthy relationships is somebody will have power over, right? So I maybe have the most money in the relationship so that I think I can make all the decisions, or I have to tell you what we're gonna eat and when to show up and what to wear and all of these things, as opposed to you making some of those decisions for yourselves. And the concerning things that I have seen are around people thinking that that is like a demonstration of care or love because somebody exerts power over you, right? So lots of concerns around like people going through your phones or telling you who you can be friends with on social media, or can you like and comment somebody else's post, like, and all of these things that make for difficult conversations in relationships. Those are actually red flags, right? So somebody telling you that you can't be friends with certain people, or that you have to wear or cannot wear certain kinds of things, is somebody trying to exert power over you. And that should be a little like ding, 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 like an alarm in your head that something's not quite right here. Because in a relationship, again, in a healthy relationship, everybody's free to make their own decisions about how they want to spend their time, what they want to wear, and those kinds of things.
So you just said something about maybe like looking at your phone. So again, no, you don't have to answer. I'm just going to ask you to think about it for yourself for a second. Have you ever been in a relationship where somebody insists that they look at your phone? No, yes, it's a mix. Are you okay with handing your phone over to somebody that you're in a relationship with? Oh, wait, no, I'm going to have to take a vote now. Okay, now I have to get a vote. How many of you, if somebody you're in a relationship with asks to go through your phone, how many of you are like, yeah, that's fine? Okay. And how many of you are like, absolutely not? Why are they asking? I think that's a good, why are they asking? I don't know. Dr. Joy, why are they asking?
Yeah, why are they asking? I don't have all the answers here. But I do think sometimes, like if it is like, oh, I lost my phone or something like that, like, can I use your phone to email a professor? That to me is one thing, but giving somebody or expecting someone to give you their phone because you're worried about like who they're talking to, or you're concerned and you want to look through those messages, like that is actually not okay. And I want us to also take accountability for the ways that we sometimes show up in relationships and have all of these questions. Because if you have to do a whole bunch of searching and you're not sure, you honestly already have your answer, right? Like if you're needing to check up on people and were they really where they said they were going to be, like there's already a suspicion of something not going on that you are okay with. And so having to check up on people, I think, is really not a good thing. And those kinds of situations typically don't end well because they tend to escalate. And so I think you have to be careful with expecting that people will can go through your things, but also the expectation that you can go through theirs.
Like bright red, right? Like on fire. That's
Bright
not
red.
a beige flag.
Right, and
No.
y'all have probably seen the meme like, oh, I saw the red flag, but I thought it meant it was a roller coaster or an amusement park. That's not what we want. Those are not the kinds of red flags that these actually are.
So,
Wouldn't it also depend on the relationship itself and where they are in that particular relationship?
What do you mean?
I was going to ask that too.
How long they've been dating? How much do they know about each other? How long have they been together to a spot of comfortability that they could even ask to see each other's phone? But it still stems back to why.
Why?
Right, yeah, and I think, you make a good point, but you could also just ask those questions, right? So, any question you have, you could ask about, as opposed to trying to snoop for the answer, because you're very likely to get a very different answer if you ask about it versus like trying to do your own investigation work.
Yeah, because I think that I love this because it's like, but why do you want to ask somebody else for their phone? What are you looking for? And so I think back to that healthy communication, you want to be able to ask that and talk about that face to face. Okay, while we're in the challenge zone of questions, so what are you seeing in your work are maybe the top, let's say the top 3 challenges or maybe concerns that you're seeing with Black women and girls when it relates more generally to their mental health, and then we can kind of come back to relationships. But what are you seeing right now?
So loneliness is the first one, and I know many of you are probably familiar with, the Surgeon General came out with all this information about how kind of post-pandemic or wherever we are in the pandemic, there's just been this epidemic of loneliness. Like we were kind of secluded in our homes and in our bubbles, so to speak, and a lot of people really struggled not having some of those connections, and we know that social support and connecting with one another really helps to bolster our mental health. So I think people are still really struggling with loneliness, and loneliness isn't so much about like not necessarily having friends, because some people will describe themselves as being lonely even in a room full of people. And so loneliness is really about like the quality of connection, and do you really feel like people see you? Do people really value you and really feeling like you have meaning to other people in your life? And I think a lot of people are struggling with that. Anxiety and depression. Anxiety is always, or at least for the past several years, has been the #1 most diagnosed mental health concern. And I think, of course, post-pandemic, that has just skyrocketed. There was research early in the pandemic that talked about like millions of people searching for stuff around anxiety when lockdown kind of first happened. And of course, I mean, there was this like random virus out here that none of us knew anything about, and we gotta like keep a mask on, and we're protecting ourselves from one another. And so of course, anxiety is going to skyrocket. But also depression kind of coexists with anxiety a lot of times. People having a more depressed mood, crying spells. And it's interesting because sometimes the depression looks very different in Black women because we haven't had the luxury of like sitting in a corner crying, right? But sometimes it shows up as more irritability or more physical health kinds of concerns. So like headaches, stomach aches, like those kinds of things. And then I will say the third one is typically some kind of relationship concern. So whether that be friendships, whether that be romantic relationships, whether that be relationships with parents. And I think when we think about all of these mental health challenges, we have to think about it against the backdrop of social media, right? So for each of those things that I've listed, there is a social media component that typically only makes it worse. So when we think about like loneliness, of course, there are lots of great ways to connect with people online, but there are also some really difficult things and difficult challenges that have been introduced that like I did not have to worry about when I was in college, that you probably didn't have to worry about, right? And so I think we have to also make sure we pay attention to like how social media interacts with all of those.
When you think about the interaction between social media and relationships, what do you see in terms of how social media portrays relationships? Like what are we learning and what are young Black women learning about relationships based on what they're seeing in social media?
So hashtag relationship goals, right? I think there's been lots of conversations really recently about, what we see on social media and how that is a highlight reel, right? So when I think about even my own experience, right? Like I have 2 little ones, they're 8 and 10. And so when I think about like a family picture that I might post, I'm taking the best of the pictures, right? So we may have taken 80 pictures, but I'm not taking pictures or I'm not showing when I can't find their toothbrushes or their matching socks or like all this randomness, right? And so when you think about what you see on social media, you have to think that that is highly curated. And I think sometimes we forget that people are only posting the best of the best, not necessarily all the blooper reels, so to speak. Look, we got an amen corner here. And so I think when you think about like social media, it does bring up a intense sense of comparison, right? So it looks like their spring break was better than mine, or, oh, look at their homecoming court, it looks so much better than mine. And there's there's been a lot of research that talks about, like, if you and I are at a party together and we're having a great time, but then, like, we get on Instagram and we see, like, our friends at another party, all of a sudden our party doesn't seem as fun anymore, right? So this whole fear of missing out and, like, feeling like other people have better lives or doing better than we are brings up a lot of comparison, which also leads to the anxiety and depression that we talked about.
Well, I love this example that you just gave about you're at a party, you're having a good time, and then you look at somebody else's party, and now it's different. Has anybody ever looked at somebody else's Instagram and thought, ooh, their life is so much better? Right. Have you ever looked at social media where it changed your opinion about what you're experiencing in the moment? Oh, I see some nods. That's right. And so I think this is really important because now I'm going to come all the way back to relationships, because knowing how to post the most beautiful, the best, the I don't even know, like the most perfect relationship pictures. That's a goal. Like, the relationship may be a goal, but I think the curated picture is the goal, or the video. So that's one thing. And then when we think about the kinds of relationships, I think they're very specific, right? They're usually a male and a female. And I want to talk about LGBTQ+ for a minute, because when we look at the data, and I wanted to grab some of this data, and it talks about, from the CDC, it talks about how intersectionality can really affect one's relationships and how they perceive themselves. Can you talk a little bit about how intersectionality fits into this whole broader conversation, and what are some of the challenges maybe that LGBTQ+ students may be experiencing, or young people may be experiencing in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the thing we haven't talked about is, like, what's happening in the entire country right now, right? And so there's specific things that I feel like have been going on for some time, but we can't brush past, like, all of the legislation and all of the things that are being passed that make it not okay to kind of be who you are. And so I think when you think about marginalized communities like LGBTQIA, if you don't see yourself represented, then it makes it seem as if, like, well, do I really have a place here? Or, like, do other people feel this way? Or can I find community in these spaces? And so that's one of the pluses, I think, to social media, is that it has opened up the world and allowed people to connect with people who maybe they wouldn't have seen on campus, but now you can form relationships with. But I do think it also introduces some challenges in that sometimes if you are holding on to something so tightly because you don't see it represented, you don't always make the best choices, right? And so I think even in relationships, in other kinds of relationships, we sometimes stick to relationships because we've been in them for a long time, right? And so it's like, oh, this person knows my history, they know so much about me, it would be so hard to find somebody else to date or a new best friend. But those relationships aren't really well-meaning for us anymore. And so sometimes, regardless of the history, regardless of the story, sometimes it's just better to cut ties.
Well, and when it comes to what we see, so those curated pictures, to me, those curated pictures are very typical, like, mostly. And so how do you think about developmentally, right? So we mostly are working, obviously, with college students. So developmentally, maybe I am a college student and I just now am like, I think I'm somewhere on that spectrum, right? Like, I'm somewhere in LGBTQ+ somewhere. I'm experimenting with that, or I'm discovering myself. Can I post my relationship? When can I post it? And are people going to judge me?
I mean, people judge everybody, right? And so I think the other thing that happens developmentally when you're in college is that you think people are paying more attention to you than they typically are, right? And so we have this running narrative in our heads of, like, oh, if I post this thing, people are going to say anything. But people are always going to have something to say. And so it's important for you to be as loud and proud and bold as you are comfortable with. Now, I do think, though, it begs some conversation with your partner or the person that you're dating, because sometimes people have very different ideas in what they're okay with being posted. But I do think if you are somebody who really wants to post about your relationship, you may not actually be compatible with somebody who wants to be super secretive, because it's likely going to cause a lot of conflict in the relationship.
I think that's just a lesson across relationships. Yes. So let's talk also about the family dynamic. So what we're trying to do is we're just going to spread like we're going to talk about a lot of things, and then we're opening it up to questions, but we want to kind of seed some things for you all to think about. Family dynamics.
The fact that you had to take a sit back.
I mean,
much.
So when we think about family dynamics, so here we are. Again, I said Mother's Day is coming up, Father's Day is coming up. What I didn't say is, and folks are going back home. Are you ready to go back home to the family dynamics? So, okay. Oh. So talk a little bit about, what are some of the things that young people should be paying attention to in terms of unhealthy dynamics, and then I have a follow-up there.
Yeah, so, the struggle of going back home after you've had a little bit of freedom at your college campus, and then you're going back to parents and caregivers' rules can really be difficult. And so I just want to acknowledge that is a struggle sometimes, right? Because you've been here kind of making your own rules, and then parents and grandparents and caregivers have their own ideas about who you are. And regardless of your age, I think sometimes you stay like the 12-year-old that you were to your family, and so they really struggle with seeing you as a grown-up. But I think having some of those conversations ahead of time can sometimes be helpful. So if you know that you and your caregivers or your parents typically get into it about curfew when you are home, I would start having some of those conversations now about like, okay, I'll be home in a couple of weeks for summer break. Can we talk about like what my curfew is going to be? Are there going to be some concessions made? Can we kind of negotiate on some things? But I also think it's important to think about, our family is what we are born into, right? So we typically don't have very much choice about our biological family or the people that have raised us, but that doesn't always mean that that's where all of your support and affirmation will come from, sadly, right? And so I think a lot of people struggle with the idea that you expect that your family, the people that are supposed to love you, will show up for you in certain kinds of ways, and the unfortunate truth is that sometimes they are not. And so especially I think sometimes with like mother-daughter relationships are very, very tenuous for lots of different reasons that we probably will go into a little later. But I think it's important to make sure that you are cultivating spaces that feel affirming and valued to you, even if it's not your family. So sometimes we get stuck because we are looking for something from our family that they are never going to be able to give us. And so the sooner that we can learn that and find other spaces where we can get that, I think we save ourselves a world of hurt.
So if someone's in a situation where they don't feel like that is a healthy environment, what are some ways that young people can set boundaries with those family members? Because the family members are still, it's sort of like back to our other types of relationships. That other person may think, oh, this is a great relationship, or this is how it's supposed to be, even though it's not healthy for the young person or the student. And so what are some ways that young women can set their own boundaries with family? Because that's tricky, because you talked about the power dynamic before. How do I set a boundary with somebody who has a more powerful position than I have?
I think you have to be very careful. I mean, especially if they're like paying for school, or if they are the reason why you are able to kind of stay in college. I think you have to be very careful. But I do think you can be mindful of like how much you share. So sometimes we give people too much power because we give them too much of our business, right? And so if mom is gonna try to
wait. I'm gonna have you say that one more time.
What did I say?
What did she say?
We give people too much power over us because we share too much of our business. And so if you know that mom is already going to try to weaponize your relationships and your friendships against you, then be very, non-disclosing with that information. It's like, oh, it was fine, right? Like you don't have to give a bunch of details if you don't want to, especially if you know people are going to use that against you. I also think like limiting how much time you spend at home. So is there a best friend's house that you can be at, like maybe a friend from high school or maybe a friend you've made here in college? Can you spend more time with them and their family if allowed than your own family? Because, if things are tense, then you want to stay out of that environment as much as possible.
And what about that inevitable moment in college life where you have a fight with your friends. What? I'm not saying anybody in particular. I'm just giving an example.
Right, of course, of course.
So, we've been best friends. You're my girl, and then something happens.
Yes.
And
stuff will
now
happen.
what?
Now what? Yeah.
What am I supposed to
think,
do? I can't stand you.
So this is kind of sometimes the like life cycle of friendships, unfortunately. And I think it's one thing if like we get into a disagreement or something, because again, we're human, we bring our own stuff, and like, can we get through it? But I do think that there is a way where we can like respectfully communicate about our differences and like get past it. And truthfully, us being able to work through conflict, typically that makes relationships stronger. So I want you to hear that like the first incident of conflict doesn't mean like, oh my gosh, we're not going to be friends anymore. It can mean that we can talk about this, we can move through this, I can hear what you said, you can hear what I said, and we can learn how we can do this differently in the future. But I do think that there sometimes is like a level of disrespect or betrayal that to me indicates this is probably not going to be a healthy friendship anymore. And so I think it is important to grieve when you have lost a friendship and to know when to walk away, right? So I think first you have to, like, if something happens, so let's say somebody like shares your business, you told your girl something and then she told some of her other friends. I think first you have a conversation about why you didn't like that and give them the opportunity to change their behavior. And if that happens again, or you realize like, okay, this person is just really not getting it, or they are intent on telling my business even though I told them I don't like this, then I think you have to say to yourself, this may not be a good friendship for me anymore. And so you would have the conversation like, hey, I've asked you several times not to do this and it doesn't feel like we can line up on what is important to us, and so I'm gonna respectfully kind of take some space here. And then you have to grieve, right? And I don't think we do a great job of like holding space for friendships in our lives because they are typically central to us, especially as Black women. There's a lot of energy and a lot of resources around like romantic relationships, but not typically for friendships. And so you do have to grieve that this significant person may no longer be a part of your life. That may mean that you have to have conversations with other friends because sometimes there's friend groups involved, right? And so you don't want somebody coming to you and telling you what so-and-so did if y'all are not friends anymore, right? And so sometimes you have to have conversations with other friends about boundaries. Like, okay, I don't want to hear or I don't want to be invited if she's going to be there. And then you give yourself time to grieve that and then give yourself the opportunity to meet new people, right? So nobody's ever going to replace that person necessarily, but that doesn't mean that you can't have healthy, fulfilling friendships in the future, even if it's not with that person.
And you had a podcast you did during Women's History Month called Girl's Girl. Yes. Talk about what that, like, how do you think about that? What do we need to learn from that?
Yeah, so many of you already have, or you will get a copy of Sisterhood Heals, which is my book. And so being a girl's girl is really, really important to me. And I think it is important to a lot of us because what it means is that I have your back even when nobody else is watching, right? And so you may have seen the quote, like, be the one who fixes someone's crown without telling everybody it was falling off kind of thing. So you don't get credit for like being a good person just to show and it be performative, right? Like, are you really having your friend's back when nobody else is watching, even when she didn't know about it? And so I think that means that we are accountable to one another. I was raised with the idea of like, if we go together, we're leaving together. Now, what you do after I drop you back off is your own business. But if you rolled with me, then I'm bringing you back to where I picked you up from. And I think it means like we are always on the lookout for one another. We are looking for opportunities to share with one another. We don't hoard resources. Like there's enough space and enough shine for all of us to win. And so even if you can't have a good opportunity, like you can celebrate somebody else's good opportunity. And I think sometimes there are so many isms that are set up to like let us fight against one another, but it really is about how we can create spaces to have one another's backs that allow all of us to win together.
What do you do in that situation where, because those were all in the positive, but what if I see something that is really hurtful to my girl? And I want to stand up for her. I want to help set boundaries because she's having a hard time setting boundaries, but I know somebody has to set boundaries. it's not safe or it's not healthy. What does that look like? How can I step in as a friend? Now she may get mad at me, but how do I do that?
Yeah, so I think when we love people, we do like go on record and say, "Hey, I'm uncomfortable with this," or like, "I wonder if you've noticed X, Y, Z." But sometimes they will get mad, right? And I think sometimes that means you have to love people from a distance, right? So if you see them kind of walking into traffic, so to speak, I think you say like, "Hey, I don't think that this is good for you," or "I've noticed these things, and I wonder if you would reconsider." But ultimately, people are going to make their own decisions, right? And I think that that's really hard for us sometimes because we love people and we don't want them to get hurt, and we can see all the signs that this thing is happening, but we can't unfortunately want more for people than they want for themselves. And so sometimes they have to learn hard lessons on their own. And I think that that can be really hard for us because sometimes we get into a system of enabling the bad behavior, right? Or the behavior that we see that is not so positive. And so it means we have to kind of take ourselves out of those situations so that if they're going to learn the lesson on their own, they will do that.
And what happens if you were the one who was told, like, a car wreck is coming, and you're walking into, like you said, you're walking into that traffic. I can see the truck, and then I get hit. So I'm the one I got hit. How do I recover? Because now I'm like, oh, Joy was right. But now I'm embarrassed. And I already had a fight with you, and we're not even friends, but I'm lying in the hospital, recovering from this. What advice do you have for the person who was the receiver of hard information, didn't want to believe it, and then it played out in that way? How do I come back from that?
Yeah. So I think you have to be very gentle with yourself, right? So you said, like, now I'm embarrassed, and you don't want to keep making bad mistakes just because you're embarrassed, and now you don't want to, you want to try to save face. And so I think we get ourselves into a lot of sticky situations because we're embarrassed, or we don't want to say, like, you were right. And so I think being gentle with yourself and compassionate with yourself, that maybe you made the best decision that you felt like you could at that time, even though there was other information, whatever was going on led you to whatever this decision was. And so there's no need in being super critical of yourself or beating yourself up, because that's not going to change what has happened. So I think the only thing that you can do is to try to make amends, right? So if you want to try to resume or repair some of those relationships with people who try to tell you, I think going to them saying, like, hey, I'm really sorry, I should have listened. And if you are the person who has tried to warn them, do your very best not to say, I told you so, right? Because what good is that, right? Like, the thing has already happened, and so they don't need to kind of continue to be beat up on or, kind of alienated by you saying, I told you, I knew this thing would happen. If there is space for you to allow them to repair the relationship, I think you should try to hold that space, because when people have, found themselves in some sticky situations, what they need more than anything is grace and compassion, because you never know when you will be the one in a situation where somebody told you so, right? So I think it's important to extend the grace and compassion we would like for other people to extend to us.
And what happens when you're just exhausted? Because either you yourself have been in a series of unhealthy relationships. That could be a romantic situation. It could be, and I think when we mean romantic, I think I'm going to ask you, what do we mean by romantic? Because that could be like a broad category. Because there are also relationships that are just purely about sex. And there are relationships that are about friendship. There are relationships that are more about love. Like, what do you mean when you say romantic?
So romantic, I think we're trying to build something together, right? So we are kind of publicly claiming one another. Like, we are kind of seen as a couple or a throuple or whatever it is.
Because I think there are all these different kinds of relationships, I think, lead to different dynamics. And each one has its own dynamics. Like you talked about, there's going to be conflict. It's going to be hard work. But what happens when you feel like I've put in all the work, whatever the relationship, the kind, could be family, could be, but I'm just exhausted. I'm tired. And so therefore, I'm not going to try to have any more relationships. I've just given up.
I think that's probably a sign that you have very loose boundaries. So when we find ourselves exhausted and depleted in relationships, it's typically because we have not said no enough. We have been doing too much of trying to save the world for other people. We have not been asking for help. We have not been saying, like, no, I can't do this thing every week at this time. Like, typically that level of exhaustion is because we have not set proper boundaries in our relationships.
I'm going to ask 2 more questions, so I want folks to start think about your questions. What I'd love to know is, you also started before talking about there are 3, like the top 3 challenges you're seeing or noticing in our community is loneliness, and loneliness isn't just I'm alone. It's I could be alone in a whole crowd. I could have all the friends and all the amazing stuff on Instagram, but I actually feel lonely. So loneliness, you talked about anxiety and depression, and then you talked about, and then relationships, and they all seem to be kind of tied together, really. What if you're in a relationship with somebody who is experiencing depression or anxiety? How do you navigate that space? Because you want to set boundaries, but you also want to be supportive.
Yeah. So I think making sure that you're aware of the resources. So you have 2 members of your counseling center staff here. So letting people know, like, hey, there's a place that you could go to talk about some of these concerns. And I think when because they may be depressed or anxious and you are seeing it, but they may not know that. And so I think when you have that conversation, it really is more about calling out behavior. So, hey, I've noticed that you've been late for your class this past 2 weeks. Or, hey, you really used to like going to choir practice and you haven't gone in the past 2 months. I want to check in about that. So calling out the behavior as opposed to you're depressed is typically a softer way into that conversation. And then letting them know about the resources, either on campus or in the greater area. Sometimes the process of like finding a therapist can be really difficult for people who are anxious and depressed. So if you do some of that legwork for them, I think that can be really helpful. Something else that people tend to say when people are depressed or anxious is, oh, hey, call me if you need anything, right? But people who are really depressed and anxious sometimes don't have the bandwidth to know what they need. And so if you can kind of be a bit intuitive and say, okay, I can go over and do a load of laundry, or I know they're struggling eating, I'll bring them something from the cafeteria, or I'll send them over something, one of their favorite foods from Uber Eats or whatever. I think, being able to kind of volunteer some of that behavior can really help to get the ball rolling. Something else that often happens with people who are depressed is that they struggle with like just general self-care. So like taking showers, washing their hair, brushing their teeth. And so something that can be really helpful is like a body double, which means like you go and sit outside the bathroom door and they just go in and like take a shower and do that kind of thing. Something about like just having somebody's presence, even if you don't say anything, can be really helpful and motivating to people to kind of get some of that stuff done.
The last question before we open it up. How can someone enact their agency to build affirming relationships that support their mental health and well-being? I wanted to read that whole thing. So, what can people do so that, because we want to focus on the positive. So, what can they do that affirms their relationship and that supports their mental health and well-being?
So I think one of the greatest things we can do is to open our mouths, right, and ask for what we need and ask for help. So I think that is something that Black women struggle with a lot, right? Like, I know I'm not the only one who is like, oh, you're not going to do it like me, so I'm going to just do it myself, right? Like, and I know I'm not the only one. And so I think getting out of our own way sometimes and, like, allowing people to show up for us is a really, really important thing that is often overlooked. So I think speaking about what we need, asserting our needs, and asking for help is really important, but also letting people know when we're struggling. I think there's all this, superwoman stereotypes and like this idea that we are carrying all the balls and all the, everything for the entire world, but that is heavy, right? Like that's heavy and it's exhausting to kind of be the one trying to hold it together for everybody in your circle, for your family, for all these things. And so I think letting people know that you're struggling and not putting that expectation on yourself or other people in your circle that you will have it all together. Like, I know we make a lot of things look easy because we're Black women and kind of that's what's expected, but a lot of stuff we do is not actually easy. And so allowing yourself to kind of fall apart and not placing these superhuman expectations on yourself, I think is one of the most loving and gentle acts you can really give to yourself.
I just thought of one last thing because I see lots of crowns. We have just started our SGA and Royal Court elections. So I hear you. And I have a leadership role. I hear you, but what about people who are leaders or considering to be leaders? They're running for a leadership role. They still have to show up like even more. The expectations are, oh, you're always going to be put together. Like we can go, the RAs, the RDs, like we have a lot of any student club leader. No. I hear you, but no. We can't get away with that. Like we always have to, we've got to always have it together. We always have to be able to respond. Isn't that right?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, and I think, when I think about like some of the most transformational leaders in my life and just people I look up to, there are people who are actually honest about having to take a step back and like take care of themselves, right? And so I think, if you can do more to create a culture of we don't have to be on all the time, or there can be more of a shared leadership, right? Like, so maybe I am the president, but I'm also asking all of the other members of my board to do other things, right? I think it's really more about like how can you share some of the load as opposed to feeling like you have to have the entire load on your back by yourself.
Right. Okay. Questions? Yes. What is happening? Oh, they had to write them down? Yeah. Oh, okay. I thought I heard that, and then I kind of wasn't listening to that part. I'm so sorry. You're our moderator?
Hello, everyone. My name is Gabrielle Harper. I'm a junior psychology major, biology minor, originally from Cincinnati, Ohio. Thank you, President Walsh and Dr. Joy, for that wonderful chat. We truly appreciate your insights. We will now transition into hearing some questions from the students. We do have a few questions that have already been prepared, so we will begin with those. But feel free to write questions down on the index cards at your table, and we'll come around to hear those questions if time allows. Please ask questions in relation to today's topic regarding mental health and relationships. So to get started, someone asked, how do we navigate a relationship with someone with mental health challenges without feeling like you're their therapist? And y'all did already touch on that a little bit, but kind of to more go into it on a one-on-one basis, because if they feel like they have nobody else, it's kind of hard sometimes.
Yeah, I think that without feeling like you're the therapist part is really important. And you will hear therapists like in your circle say like, I'm a therapist, but I'm not your therapist, right? I know you know, Ryan. So even your friends in your circle that may be therapists, they're not like holding space for you in the way they do with their typical clients. And so I think if you are finding yourself in that space, you have to be careful not to ask too many leading questions, right? Because it's hard to like bottle myself up if you're asking the kinds of questions a therapist might ask, right? And so being careful with the kinds of questions that you're asking, and again, trying to direct them to the support services that exist, because even if you want to do a great job and like hold space for them as a friend, it can become exhausting, right? And if you're not trained and you don't know what to do with the kind of information they give you, it could actually be more harmful than helpful. And so I think putting some boundaries around how much you're listening, how many questions you're asking, and again, trying to like point them to the resources is a really good idea.
Thank you for that. So speaking on boundaries, the next question says, how do we balance working on our mental health along with balancing relationships in school and college life?
So I like to tell people you are not a continuous self-improvement project, right? So I think, again, this is something else that happens because of social media. Like you follow all of these like self-help accounts and there's like every day there's some new thing you need to be working on. And a part of us being human is that we're not going to be perfect. So none of us have perfect mental health. Like that doesn't actually exist. And so I think kind of keeping a list of maybe the things you want to work on and like trying one or two things at a time, because you can overwhelm yourself with always thinking like you need to be working on boundary setting and assertiveness and communication. Like it can be too much. So keep a running list of the kinds of things that you want to work on and prioritize, So if schoolwork is really heavy this week, like we don't have to do too much around like boundary setting, right? But I also think it's important to know that boundary setting does help you to hold space for your schedule, right? Because you can look at your boundaries where you're saying yes to too many people, and that may be why you don't actually have room to do the studying that you need to do. So sometimes they also go hand in hand.
Thank you. Okay, so kind of leading into the next question based on what you were speaking of. So, in those times where maybe the campus is more stressed, or like right now, this week is campaign season, so between staff and students, everybody's running around. So, how do we continue to cultivate positive relationships and an uplifting environment on campus between both peer to peer and student to faculty and staff relationships?
It is a great question, and I think participating in stuff like this really helps, right? And I think if there are spaces where faculty can come and talk about the concerns that they're having, I think that just again models for everybody on campus that nobody has it all together, right? I think also when times are really stressful, you have to be mindful that everybody's fuse is probably a little shorter, and so maybe people are a little snappier right now, and so apologizing if you realize like you came across short, or being able to accept an apology for somebody who maybe came across short, I think is really good idea. And giving one another grace right now, that everybody may not be showing up as their best selves because everybody's a little more stressed.
I think going back to your social media comments before, so also because it is campaign season, students are starting to post their campaign materials. And so should I get anxious if I'm running and I don't have as many likes as I would like? Like, does that, what do I do?
Yeah, so there's so much like weirdness behind these algorithms, and like what time do you post, and does it have music, and like all of these things. Like there's so much of that really is not in your control, but the things that are actually in your control is running the best campaign that you can, right? So I wouldn't spend too much time worrying about things that you actually don't have control over. I would focus more on talking with your student body here on campus, or what kind of platform are you running on? Like, are you really in the race for the right kinds of reasons? Like focusing on those kinds of things is probably worth more of your time than focusing on the algorithms.
So switching gears to something that you can't control, Dr. Joy, you did touch on this a little earlier about mentioning kind of balancing about the amount of time you spend in specific environments. But how do you navigate your way through an abusive parental relationship that you have to when you have to maintain contact with them?
So, I mean, the key word to me there is abusive. And so, any kind of abusive situation you do want to be mindful of. And I think one of the most difficult parts of, when you find yourself in abusive relationships is that you want to be careful not to internalize any of those messages about you, because people are not being abusive to you because of anything that you have done. It really is more about them. And so there's no gentle tone that you can use, or, you got to be careful not thinking that there's something that you can do that will stop abuse, because people who are abusive will be abusive regardless of how nicely you talk to them. But I think that does go back to, kind of making sure that you're kind of keeping in those situations only as much as you need to, having a support system who can support you, and so going places where people like don't make you feel bad about the abuse that's happening, and people that will give you resources, that will give you time, that will give you space to be, because they know that you're dealing with this with your parents. I think that's really a good idea, and not being like secretive about it, because abuse really thrives in secrecy, and so letting somebody else know about what's happening, I think, is a really good idea.
And I would just say, I think that, is Professor Karewa here? Yes. So Professor Karewa, I also think that if students have availability in their schedules, they should take the wellness, I don't remember what you call the class, the wellness recovery plan. The Wellness Recovery Action Plan. If you're a student at Bennett or at A&T, you can come take that too. But I think it's really important to think about, have a plan, and have a plan before you go home. But I think especially be really mindful of the word abusive. If it is not safe, take action immediately. Please talk with a counselor, talk with police if appropriate, but don't put yourself back in that same situation if it is not safe. So think about safety first.
And thank you for whoever asked that question because sometimes this can be more common than we recognize, but like people may be scared to speak up about it or ask that question. So thank you for asking that question because it might have answered that question for somebody else who didn't necessarily feel comfortable asking it. The next question is, what are some common misconceptions about therapy, particularly among Black women, and how do we address them?
That's one of my favorite questions. Thank you for asking that. So one of the biggest misconceptions about therapy is that you only go in a crisis, right? So that if something bad has happened, that is the only time to seek therapy. Now that is, of course, when a lot of people seek therapy, but there's also a lot of really great work that you can do if you go to therapy before a crisis actually happens. And we might even be able to prevent the crisis because you came in early enough. So I think that's one of the biggest. The second one is that, oh, it's just like talking to a friend. And in some ways, talking with a therapist is like talking to a friend. But in therapy, the therapist is not telling you a whole bunch about their own business, right? Like when you talk with your girls, like you're sharing about your stuff and they're sharing about theirs. The therapist is really there to only hold space for your stuff. And so it's really like an uninterrupted time for you to really just focus on yourself. I think the third thing is that sometimes that comes up for Black women is like this confusion around spirituality and faith, that if you have to go to a therapist, that means you don't have a strong faith relationship, or you don't have a great walk with God, or whatever, the terminology is. But these things can coexist. So you can still have a very active faith relationship and be, a church member and all of those things and talk with the therapist. Like you don't have to see them as canceling one another out.
Thank you. So sometimes as young Black girls in today's society, we can struggle with knowing whether we should leave the relationship or whether it's who they are or where they are. So what indicators are there to know that it's time to actually leave the relationship and not just kind of be like, oh, they're going through something right now? Yeah.
So typically people leave relationships way too late, honestly, because we do a lot of like talking ourselves out of these red flags, or maybe we have a circle who's kind of validating like the bad behavior, which is not good. But typically people leave way too late. And so if you're already asking yourself like, does this feel good to me? It probably does not, right? Like that's probably already an indication that something is off and that at least there's a conversation that needs to happen. And the other thing is we do a lot of, what's the word? Like rationalizing bad behavior, right? So even if you know why somebody is doing something because they have their own difficult relationship with a parent or because they've had trauma or whatever, that doesn't excuse bad behavior. And so even if you know why somebody is doing something, that doesn't mean that you have to continue to be privy to this, right? Like you don't have to continue within a relationship with somebody even if you know why they are doing the things that are harmful.
Thank you. So that was all the questions that we had previously prepared. So yeah, now we'll open it up to the crowd.
Do you want to add? You're in charge.
We have a mic.
Oh,
we have a mic, so you
Look
can
at
ask
that.
your own question.
Are
But I
you
think
also accept? Can I just wait? Are you also accepting card? Like if somebody doesn't want to stand
Yeah,
up?
I was about to say that. So if y'all raise your hand around ways of we get read it, respond, just.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, President Walsh and Dr. Bradford, for being here. I'm a student at A&T Radia Pinckney, and I have a quick question. Do you feel that the stigma of Black mental health awareness has improved in the Black community? And if not, how do we make any improvements with that?
Thank you. That's a great question. So I definitely think stigma has decreased, right? Like the fact that we're all in this room having a conversation about mental health, 20 years ago we might not have been, right? And so I think that the stigma is decreasing, but there's still a lot of work to do, right? I think some of the things that help to chip away at that stigma, again, are programs like this. Every time like a celebrity or a high-profile person comes out and talks about their experience working with a therapist or their recent mental health diagnosis, like I think that goes a long way in making people think, oh, if they can talk about this, then I can talk about it as well. But there is still a lot of work to do. And I think one of the easiest ways for us to do, the question we always get is, how do I make my mom go to therapy? Or how do I, make my sister go to therapy? And truthfully, you being a role model of being in your own therapy is often the best way to signal to other people that they might also benefit from therapy.
Hi. I wanted to ask, what made you want to be an author on the specific subject, and how did you accumulate your answers in the book?
How did I accumulate what?
Your answers in the book?
Answers in the book. Thank you. That's a great question. So I always figured I would write a book at some point in my career, but I actually was planning an event called Sisterhood Heals that was going to happen in the pandemic. So it was planned for March of 2020, and then of course we know what happened. And so the outline for the book kind of became the kinds of things that I wanted to have happen at the event. And when I think about like my own life and the work even of therapy for Black girls, like so much of it is revolved around sisterhood, right? Like the relationships I have had with other Black women, the women I've worked with in my practice who have had other relationships with Black women. I think sisterhood is really at the root of healing for a lot of us. And so having content and resources about how can we talk about these really, really meaningful relationships in our lives that like other people are not talking about, right? Again, there's so many quizzes on like Essence and Cosmo about like how to get ready for your first date and, you know, like how to keep things spicy and all these things, but not about friendship necessarily. And so I really wanted to add to that literature so that we could have good conversations about how we do well when we are in community with other Black women, but also some of the things we need to pay attention to. And so the book is as much a celebration of Black girls' relationships with one another, but also an invitation to us doing things better, right? So how do we have conversations around things like colorism and texturism and how that impacts our friendships? How do our friendships change when somebody gets married, maybe before we do, and like sometimes jealousy pops up, like some of those ugly things that we don't want to talk about, I also talk about in the book. Thank you.
I do have a few that they just gave us. The first one is, how can we address the unique challenges and barriers that Black individuals face in accessing mental health care, and what steps can be taken to ensure that mental health services are culturally competent and inclusive?
Ooh, that's a great question. Did everybody hear her? Heard some energy there. So one, I think that it is important for us to kind of make sure that we are lobbying like our elected officials for more community mental health services. So sadly, one of the first things that is often cut when budget cuts happen is community mental health. And so I think making sure we're voting into office people who actually have that as something they want to have as a part of their platform, I think is really important. We had a conversation in the other room about like insurance companies and how sometimes you're paying a lot for insurance, but then insurance like doesn't cover therapy or something like that. And so I think lobbying our insurance companies, I think, is also really important. But also just knowing the resources that do exist. So you've already seen like a slideshow of the crisis text line that exists, the Steve Fund, the Loveland Foundation. Like there are lots of resources that do exist that we don't sometimes know about. And so I think when you find a good resource that's related to mental health, making sure that you share that you support that you kind of get the word out about these resources that do exist. And in terms of like culturally affirming, culturally competent care, that isn't something we necessarily can do as like a general consumer, but I do think therapists have a responsibility. So even if everybody in here who's a Black woman wanted a Black woman therapist, there are not enough of us to go around, right? And so there's some work that we can do, but it also means that our non-Black counterparts that are therapists need to make sure that they are doing their work to be able to hold space in ways that feel affirming and valued for Black women clients.
I just have a follow-on to that, because are you worried at all? So North Carolina, on the public higher ed side, the University of North Carolina system is on the verge, probably, of eliminating DEI roles, DEI as a diversity, equity, inclusion programming. So how do we make sure that therapists are being trained when in a number of states, especially if you're at a large public university, like we don't have this at Bennett as a private or an independent college, but are you worried about cultural competency? Because who's going to teach it, and how are they going to secretly teach it?
Right, I'm very worried. Honestly, I'm very worried. I did not know that was coming down the pipeline in North Carolina.
Yes, we are just a suburb of Texas,
and Florida. Yeah, so I mean, it has been very unfortunate and scary to see that those kinds of conversations are, kind of being erased and like being banned in terms of like the books that are not allowed to even be shared in schools anymore. So I do think that even when we were not worried about DEI efforts being rolled back, the counseling field still had a lot of work to do. Now it just means that there's even more work to do. I have even been concerned with an organization called Therapy for Black Girls, because I don't know if many of you have paid attention. Like, there's this initiative, there's a venture capital company called the Fearless Fund that was like giving money to Black women specifically to start their business, and like somebody filed a lawsuit. And so, there are all these things that like are attacking, our efforts to be able to like support one another. And so I think we have to be very careful and like try to do as much work as we can to get ahead of some of this. But sadly, that is the state of the world. And I think that adds to the mental health concerns, right? Like when you see people trying to roll back these things that have actually overwhelmingly been positive, it does, kind of make you feel like, oh, well, what's the point?
What advice can you give to someone who wants to seek help but doesn't like talking about their problems?
Ooh. So talk therapy is probably the most popular form of therapy, but there's tons of other kinds of therapy. So you can do dance and movement therapy. So we have an actual episode on the podcast that talks about like how a therapist, I think she's actually in North Carolina, uses dance and movement to actually like help you to connect with what's going on. So you don't have to start with talk therapy. There is like yoga therapy, so you can work with a yoga therapist. There's equine therapy, so people who will like let you ride a horse and like talk to you in that kind of way. There's creative arts kind of therapy. And so if talking is not what you want to kind of start with, there are lots of different ways that you could work with a therapist that don't require you to kind of just be sitting across from somebody sharing all your stuff for 45 minutes.
Okay, this is the last one that I have right here, so let's start raising your hand so we can, make our way back around. As a person who cares, I'm so sorry, that was so loud. As a person who cares much about their relationship and puts time into it, how do you know when to leave it if it hasn't worked by that point?
Can you read that again?
Mm-hmm. As a person who cares much about their relationship and puts time into it, how do you know when to leave it if it hasn't worked by that point?
So, relationships don't always have a deadline, but I think we can set deadlines for ourselves, right? So if you say like, okay, if by the holiday break I don't see improvement or this has not done X, Y, Z, it's okay to leave a relationship. But you do have to make sure that you have voiced whatever those expectations were, right? Like we talked about earlier. So if there's something that's not happening or something that you would like to not happen, you do have to let the other person know like, hey, I'm not okay with this, or like, I would really like it if you did X, Y, and Z. And then give, whatever the timeline is. And if you don't see change behavior or improved behavior, then it's okay to just walk away. I think, again, we talked about like, sometimes we wait way too long, and like anytime you don't want to be in a relationship is reason enough, right? Like we don't have to have like a whole list of all these things that somebody has done. Like if you just feel like I'm not really growing in this relationship, or I don't feel like myself, there are all these things that I used to really like to do that I don't do in this relationship. At any point, if you feel like a relationship is not what you want, you have permission to leave. You don't have to wait until things get really bad or until, something happens.
Well, and I think it's also like, what is making you stay now? That's the thing. Like, why do you think you have to stay? You have to kind of and you have to be honest with yourself about that. You're not going to change the person if that's part of what your goal is.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a question. How do you handle constantly being let down to where the point where you believe you shouldn't ask for help?
That's a great question. So how do you deal with like constantly being let down to the point where you feel like you shouldn't ask for help? So my immediate response is that you may not be asking the right people. Because I think sometimes we like, again, going back to the family conversation, right? Like we keep wanting and hoping that our family will do this thing, and we just have to realize sometimes that our family is just not set up to do that, either because of resources, because of knowledge, because of whatever. And so that doesn't mean that you don't have needs and that you don't have a right to ask. It may just mean that you need to find somebody else to ask who does actually have the bandwidth or the resources to be able to support you in the ways that you're looking for.
How do you, there's, I'm from the West Coast, and people will talk about having a family of choice versus a family of birth. Talk about, like, what do you look for in those right people?
Yeah, chosen family. And probably many of you are creating that right now. Like, y'all are probably meeting the people who will be aunties to your babies and, like, your bridesmaids and, like, all of these things. And so I think looking at the places where you really do feel like you light up, right? Like those people that you really love when you get a chance to connect with, like those are the people that can be a part of your chosen family. So again, our biological family is what we are born into, but as we grow up, we get to create what we want families to look like. And so that may include biological family, but it also may include all of these other people that you meet here in school, that you meet in grad school, that you work with. Like you get to create what family looks like for you.
And am I looking for people who just agree with me and make me feel good all the time?
Not necessarily. So, you don't necessarily want to feel bad all the time in a relationship, but sometimes it does not feel good when we get called out, right? And sometimes we get called out or in for our benefit, right? Like, so if somebody sees you making mistakes, that may not feel good to hear, but it doesn't mean that they didn't say it with love. And so you don't want just a bunch of yes men or yes women in your corner, right? Like anybody can tell you yes. You do also want people who will challenge you and help you to grow to become the best possible self you can be.
Hi, I'm Michelle, a sophomore here at Bennett College, and I wanted to really quickly go back to the friendship dynamics. My mom has this saying that she said to me since I was little, and I use it around campus, which is good roots, bad fruits. Essentially what that means is that somebody has good roots and they're a good person, but they're just having a bad season right now. So how do you decipher between who has good roots and bad seasons and who actually has bad roots?
Ooh, that's such a great question and a great saying from Mom. So I think there has to be some longevity, right? Like you can't assess the root system, so to speak, if like you've never seen anything good from this person. So you can't say like, okay, there's just a bad season if like historically they have not been good to you. Now, if there's been somebody that you've known since like your first year here and then you get to third year and things start changing, I think that does allow for a conversation like, hey, this feels very different. Like, what's going on? Like, I want to check in. But if somebody doesn't have that good history with you, then I don't know that we can jump to, oh, this is just a bad season because they haven't shown you anything else otherwise.
Hello. My name is Genesis. I am Miss Junior, and I would like to ask a question. In a relationship / friendship, how can somebody define what is reality or just having, having, you know how you have faith in somebody versus who they are? How does somebody define that? Yeah,
Potential.
like how can somebody define potential of a person versus who they really are?
This is such a great question. I think college is the perfect place for like potential, right? Like you can already see like who people are going to be, but you also have to take people for who they are right now, right? Because I think a lot of us get ourselves into trouble thinking like, oh, at some point they are going to be this thing that I see they're going to be. But if they don't actually want that for themselves, then you are just kind of creating this story and this fantasy that doesn't actually match up to reality. And so it is okay to hold space for potentiality, so to speak, but to also ground yourself in what's happening right now. And so if they are not speaking to you nicely, if they are not reliable, they don't show up when they say they're going to, they're not consistent, just because you see the potential for them to do that is not enough for you to stick around right now. So you can revisit in 2 years when maybe they have reached this potential, but if right now they're not showing you any of that, then you have to take them for what they say right now.
Well, and I love that when I think about those of you who are seniors, when I think about all your different friendships, right? From when you were a fresh woman, there were people you saw potential in when you were all fresh women together. And then maybe the roots, I don't know if it was the roots or the fruit, something changed. The root, okay. And then there are some that you didn't see potential in, but by senior year, somehow you are so close and you are friends, but freshwoman year, you did not see potential in them. So I think that as you are going through college, just like when you go through high school, you have to think about that stage, that you're going to change your friend group, you're going to change who you are because you're growing and developing. And so you don't want to get a fixed mindset, as Dr. Dweck calls it. You want to have a growth mindset about each other and about yourself.
Hey again. I'm Misa. I'm a Miss Junior at Dudley High School. I said that because I want like an answer. You were saying like young girls, like young ladies. So one of my friends said, what if I'm in a relationship with someone who avoids communication at all costs due to feeling criticized? Regardless of how much I reassure them, it's just like it's just a conversation. Like, so how do you go with that? Like in high school relationships.
Yeah, so this is a great lesson, I think, to learn even in high school, that again, you can't want something more for somebody else than they want it for themselves. And so it sounds like we understand why this person struggles with communication, right? Like they've been really criticized, but it sounds like she is trying to do all she can to reaffirm them and reassure them. But if they don't want to talk, then you can't force them to talk. And so it could be that they need to do some therapy or get support from somewhere else before they are ready to kind of have the kind of relationship that it sounds like she is seeking. But I think you don't want to get yourself stuck holding space for the potential, again, of like, oh, I know that they really want to talk, and if they could just do X, Y, Z, but the truth is that they're not. And so I think the sooner we learn to like honor ourselves and what we want and need in relationships, and then exit when we are not getting that, it is just a great lesson for as you go through life.
And you'll keep learning it over and over because our college students have a version of that as well, and we have a doctoral level student from A&T. I mean, we've got the whole range, all the range. But I think it's over. Like you're going to try things in relationships, and they're going to fail. But you want to be able to figure out while you're still in college, even at the graduate level, you still want to figure out what works for you, and you want to give people a chance over their developmental cycle too. Who has the mic? Oh.
So as someone who's grown up with 7 brothers and was never so close with my mom, I've always struggled to cultivate and maintain positive relationships with girls and women. And I have always craved that sisterhood and that female companionship. So how should I go about that?
Well, you're sitting at this table with a crown, which means that you're already a part of this sisterhood of women. And so I want you to give yourself credit for the ways that you're already showing up and doing that work, and just continue to push yourself, right? And thank you for asking this question, because sisterhood really is impacted by what we have been taught about other Black women from our moms and our grandmothers and our aunties. And so if we didn't have a strong relationship with our mom, it can make it difficult to trust other women because you couldn't trust the first woman who was supposed to be there for you, right? And so I think it's really good that you acknowledge that, hey, this may be a struggle for me, but you're putting yourself in situations where you can cultivate these kinds of relationships and know that you won't always get it right, right? Like, because again, we're human, and so sometimes you will make mistakes. Sometimes the difficulties that came from that relationship with mom will rear their head in relationships with other women. And so I think it's about slowing it down to say, oops, there's that thing again. This isn't really about what she said. This is about really my feelings about my mom. How can I actually stay in this moment and allow this person to be who they are, and not always think I can't have good relationships because the relationship with mom was difficult?
Well, and I think that I could probably point to, we have college students at Bennett College, a women's college, where we have students who show up who are like, I really didn't have any girlfriends when I was growing up. I'm one. And so it does take time. But this point about your relationship with your mom, or like the first woman that's supposed to really kind of teach you about women's friendships, this is an interesting question, because how much of who we are is rooted in our relationship with whoever that first female contact is?
Probably 90%, honestly, right? Because, as we grow up, like, we take meaning from the people around us. And so usually that is mom, grandmother, auntie. And so much of who we are as college students actually comes from the history we've gotten from the other women in our lives. Now, that doesn't mean that you're stuck there. That's the beautiful thing about being at a place like Bennett, right? Like, if you have not had good relationships with women, what an amazing opportunity you have to do something differently here. And so I think, but our history does play a large part of it. And so as we get older, a lot of what we're doing is unlearning these ideas about competition with other women. I heard a lot of messages around like being careful with your romantic partners around other women because somebody's always after your boo, like all of these different kinds of things that as you get older, you realize like that's not true. Like I have all these other relationships that show me that these things that I learned were not actually accurate. And so I think allowing ourselves to stay open to learning more and to being different than we have in the past is really the key to like these fulfilling relationships.
Hi, my name is Jessica. I'm a graduating senior, and I attend Benton College. I have two questions. Okay. So my first question is, how do you give yourself grace in such strong leadership positions? Because I know for myself, I'm hard on myself, and I don't know how to give myself some grace. Yeah, that's my first question. Okay. And then my second question is, how do you handle situations when you are considered an assertive person all the time? Like straightforward, pretty, like, yeah, because I'm pretty blunt and straightforward, and I just want to, yeah.
Okay, great questions. So the first one, how do you give yourself grace? It is a practice like many other skills, because a lot of times we are very critical. Like it's very easy for us to be critical of ourselves. It's not as easy for us to be kind and gentle. And so one of the best ways to practice that is to talk to yourself the way you would talk to a best friend, right? So if your best friend made a mistake on an assignment or forgot to turn something in, you're probably not going to say, you're so stupid, you never do this right? But for a lot of us, we turn on ourselves in very strong, critical ways. And actually, a lot of times if we go back and do like a search, that voice is not even our own. It is from some caregiver in our early lives who was super critical of ourselves, right? And so that's a great exercise for you to do. When you find yourself being really critical, whose voice is it actually that you're listening to and rewriting that voice? So one way to practice is to talk with yourself the way that you would a best friend, and to just allow yourself to make mistakes. Like take away that expectation that you always have to be on or that you're always going to get stuff right, even if you're in a leadership position. I mean, if we look at the history of leaders in this country, we know that there are lots of mistakes that have been made. And so any way that you can get under that bar, you're probably doing great, right? So that's the answer to your first question. Your second question was, remind me, would you say?
How do you handle situations?
Oh, when you're blunt and straightforward. So I don't think that there's anything wrong with being straightforward, but I think sometimes the tone of that is what matters, right? So most people are not opposed to you like being straightforward with them, but what's the tone that you're using, right? So is there a way that you need to kind of say things nicely? You know, we talk about like a compliment sandwich, so like giving somebody like, hey, you did a great thing there. I wonder if you would consider whatever this thing is, but great job on whatever, you know, so kind of sandwiching that criticism so that it isn't as difficult to take may be something. But if you are just somebody who's straightforward, I say that, but also want you to be mindful of not like changing who you are, because if that is who you are, that's okay. But there are soft skills we do need to learn as leaders, right? And so a part of what we need to know is how to actually talk with someone so that you can get your point across in a way that's effective.
Well, and I think it's also recognizing your own energy at that moment, because the tone comes from also like, am I mad when I'm giving this specific feedback? And so not maybe doing it in the moment when you're angry, but actually waiting and maybe giving that feedback at another moment in time, because that will change your tone, because your energy will change. And I'm wondering, you know, the Steve Fund is named for Steve. And I think, you know, one of the reasons that this foundation was this fund was so important for his family to create was because the way that mental health presents itself in communities of color is very different than it presents itself, you know, in the white community. And so as we're having these conversations, and as Jessica was asking her question, I was also thinking about sometimes we don't know that somebody's depressed, or maybe we don't even know that we're depressed, but we're lashing out, which is actually something that's really different about the way that depression presents in the African American community. Can you just talk a little bit about again, like, how does depression present itself that maybe isn't the way we expect? Because I think when we think about depression, we think about somebody who can't get out of bed, who's hiding out, but sometimes it can present in a really different way.
Yeah, you're very right. And like I said, a lot of times it is more irritability. So if you are not somebody who typically is very irritable, but you notice, in the past couple of weeks you found yourself more on edge, that's likely a sign that something's going on. Difficulty with motivation is also a hallmark depressive symptom that I think we often miss. Changes to your sleep, so either sleeping more or less. So it's not just sleeping more, it could also be sleeping less. And also eating more or less. So again, it's not just eating more, it could also be about eating less. A loss of interest in things that you typically really enjoy doing. So maybe you really love to dance, and then the past 6 weeks, like, you just don't want to go to dance class anymore. So all of those things, I think, are signs that something is going on. Now, to have a full diagnosis, so to speak, like, there are so many that you have to meet on a list. But I think even if you don't meet the criteria for a depressive disorder, it could be a sign that you may want to talk with somebody and go get some support. I think something that we haven't talked about that I do really want to make sure we pay attention to is we are in year 4 or 5. Time feels very relative at this point, right? Post 2020. And I think we have to pay attention to all of the different ways that grief is manifesting in ways that we do not recognize. And so there have been so many losses in the past several years. One, many of us have lost people to the pandemic, or people, passed away for different kinds of reasons. But there's also been the loss of experiences. So many of you had your maybe freshman, sophomore years kind of robbed by having to be at home for the pandemic. Many of you maybe didn't have a senior trip or your senior prom, or there are all these experiences that also didn't happen, and that is also grief. And so I think it is important for us to pay attention to how grief shows up. And again, it's not just about crying, and it's not just about the loss of life. It is also about the loss of experiences, the loss of expectations. I expected to be X, Y, Z in my career, and now that has not happened. And so there's a lot of grief that I think is just kind of around the country at this point, right? Like, there's just a lot of grief that's heavy, hanging in the air. And I want you to be sensitive to that, maybe what is going on for you, even if you can't quite name it as grief.
Well, and sometimes when you experience grief, I'm coming back to relationships, you sort of snuggle up to somebody that you think is going to help you through that grief, and they may be the right person to help you through that grief, but not necessarily the person beyond that moment. So how do you think about the role that grief plays in how I interact with other people in various kinds of relationships?
Grief, kind of like a lot of other things, sometimes like clouds our vision, because you make different decisions when you are grieving than you might otherwise. And so I think it's okay to allow whatever the support system looks like in a moment of grief, but to your point, understand that it may not be the same support system you need when you're not actively grieving. And so it doesn't mean that this was like a cheap relationship or that it wasn't significant. It could just mean that it was a time-sensitive kind of relationship, and that's what you needed to get you through one point, but that going forward you may need something very different.
Great. Are there do you have other questions?
Unfortunately, that is all the time that we were allowed for questions.
Oh, that we're allowed.
Yes. Sorry if your question didn't get answered. Your sisters just had so many great ones. Hopefully there will be another opportunity to continue this conversation. Uh-oh.
Thank you, moderator.
We will.
I still have to close out this part. What are you going to say?
We will now invite Ms. Ryan Peterson up here to do her part.
Okay, before you do your part, may I do my part? Okay. So thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Joy. for this relationships, different kinds of relationships, how you build boundaries, that conflict isn't necessarily bad, that relationships are maintenance, and that, sisterhood means having your back, and that sisterhood is also based on what we've been taught, and sisterhood is healing. So thank you for helping us. Hopefully there was some beginnings of some healing, that you started to create kind of a map for yourselves. Again, if you're a student at Bennett or A&T, you can take Professor Correa's class. It's in the mini-mester 1 usually, right? So it's a 2-week session. So consider taking that. I think that's a really important class. You know your resources in our counseling team. Please make sure you're reaching out to them. Also, again, if you're a Bennett student, you also have telehealth, and if it's timely care, thank you, timely care for an emergency. But thank you. This was a timely and important conversation.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, first, we just want to say thanks again. Prez literally did the takeaway, so thank you. Perfect. No, don't be sorry. That was perfect. I do want to briefly invite Mr. David McGee up, who is the executive director of the Steve Fund. Keeping in mind we are transitioning, I know our Dudley students do have to get back to school, so just please keep a look at an eye on your watch. After he does his spiel, we are going to make sure you all are dismissed so you can avoid all the traffic, okay? Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you, President Walsh, and thank you, Dr. Joy, and thank you all for showing up. My name is David McGee, and I have the pleasure of serving as the CEO of the Steve Fund. I know I'm a little out of place in here with all of these ladies, so I'm going to make it quick because I don't want no problems. But just thank you for being here. This has been such a, what I like to call a courageous conversation that you all have engaged in. And on behalf of the Steve Fund, I just wanted to thank you so much. We have a couple of prizes. But the young people in the room, if you could just do me a quick favor, raise your hand as high as you can. Okay. Now raise it a little higher. Okay. So I'll end my remarks by saying this. When I asked you all to raise your hand as high as you can, you did it. And then I asked you to raise it a little higher, and you did it, which means that you all are capable of doing more than you can even imagine. Because when I said as high as you can, you did that thing. And then the moment I said just a little higher, somehow, some way, you raised it a little higher. So as our phenomenal panelists have said, continue to give yourself grace, take care of yourself, love yourself, but more importantly, know that you are capable of even more that you can imagine. Thank you all so much, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Just blessed us real fast. That was quick, in and out. Thank you. We appreciate you. I am going to give out 2 quick raffles just to students at random who ask questions. We always appreciate your participation in these courageous conversations. Here you go. Oh, thank you. You're so welcome. As I'm walking and talking, Dudley ladies, please go ahead and feel comfortable wrapping up all of the things. If you rode here on the bus, you all may go ahead and begin your departure now. All right, just to make sure that you're able to get back. That was no shade, please, okay? We've all been in high school, right? We all rode on the activity bus, yes? Okay, thank you. We're happy that our young ladies are here getting these good gems with us. I also want to give out a quick unsolicited tidbit. When you all return this fall, whether you are a Dudley student, an Aggie, or a Bennett Bell, I would like to share that we are going to have some really amazing mental health opportunities here on campus. No, I can't say everything, but yes, I can say that if you stay in touch with the wellness team here at Bennett, you will probably be invited to participate in some really, really, really dope, mind-blowing opportunities that will be accessible, that will be 100% free, and that will be absolutely Black girl focused. So I want to give it up to Prez and just the team here at Bennett for being really dope and making that happen. Here you go. You're welcome. I was looking for, the people who were asking the questions. Outside of that, thanks, Dr. Joy. If you are not yet following her podcast, Therapy for Black Girls, it's an amazing space. More specifically for our college and high school students, there are some episodes in a series she has a U behind. If you're looking specifically for college-focused or college preparatory conversations or more age-appropriate conversations, those episodes are a little bit more geared specifically towards you. If you are looking for a therapist, a Black therapist specifically, or one who is culturally competent, Therapy for Black Girls is also a leading directory and 100% free to join and find someone who can help you on your healing journey. I think that's pretty much all of the things I'm supposed to say. If you have a blue star on your name tag, in a few minutes, again, we are going to start transitioning. We are going to invite you to join us over at Steele Hall. And if you have not yet, with the blue star, received your book, please grab one in the lobby on your way out. Your star could be some other color too, apparently. All right? So if you have a star on your name tag, okay, feel free to join us over in Steele Hall. I hope you all had some delicious and nutritious lunch. Cheers to Ebony Soul, and you guys having a great week. I think this is a great way to start. Keep in mind everything you heard today. Love your sisters, have your sisters' backs, and go forth and be merry. Happy Monday, girls.